Ahoy, and welcome aboard. I'm the captain of this channel, Captain Sleepy. This boring sleep story is about the mundane life of a pirate. Chapter 3, The Night's Watch and Sleeping Arrangements. The tale is gently narrated by Edmund Fairchild. Sleep well.
The operation of a sailing vessel required constant vigilance and labor, with crew members organized into watch systems that divided the day into shifts. This system ensured that the ship was always manned and that essential tasks could be performed around the clock. But it also meant that sailors rarely enjoyed uninterrupted rest, and that chronic sleep deprivation was an accepted part of maritime life. Understanding the watch system and its effects on pirate crews reveals fundamental aspects of daily life at sea that shaped every other aspect of existence aboard ship. The watch system aboard pirate vessels followed patterns similar to those used on merchant and naval ships, though pirate democracy and the unique circumstances of pirate operations sometimes created variations from standard practice. The fundamental need remained the same. Ships had to be sailed 24 hours per day, weather had to be monitored constantly, and someone had to be alert to spot opportunities for prizes or threats from pursuers. These requirements meant that the crew's time was divided between periods of active duty on watch and periods of rest off watch, with the cycle repeating endlessly for as long as the voyage continued. The watch system organization. The division of the crew into watches created a rotating system where different groups of men would be on duty at different times. The most common system divided the crew into two watches, called the starboard watch and the larboard watch, with each watch standing duty for 4 hours before being relieved by the other watch. This 4 hours on, 4 hours off pattern continued day and night, structuring the crew's entire existence around the watch cycle. The 4-hour watch cycle. The traditional maritime day was divided into 6 4-hour watches and 2 2-hour watches, with each watch having a traditional name. The afternoon watch ran from noon to 4 in the afternoon. The first dog watch ran from 4 in the afternoon to 6 in the evening. The second dog watch ran from 6 in the evening to 8 in the evening. The evening watch, also called the first watch, ran from 8 in the evening to midnight. The middle watch ran from midnight to 4 in the morning. The morning watch ran from 4 in the morning to 8 in the morning. The forenoon watch ran from 8 in the morning to noon, completing the cycle. The 2-hour dog watches served an important purpose. By creating an odd number of watches in the daily cycle, they ensured that a crew member who stood the evening watch one day would stand a different watch the next day, rather than being stuck on the same watch indefinitely. Without the dog watches, a sailor who drew the unpopular middle watch would stand it every night, while sailors who drew the more desirable evening watch would always have that assignment. The dog watches rotated the schedule, distributing the burden more fairly. The bell system marked time within each watch, with bells being struck at half-hour intervals to indicate how much of the watch had elapsed. 1 bell sounded after the first half hour, 2 bells after 1 hour, 3 bells after an hour and a half, and so on up to 8 bells at the end of each 4-hour watch. The striking of 8 bells signaled the change of watch, with the oncoming watch relieving the watch that had just completed its duty. The bells provided the primary time reference for sailors who organized their activities around the bell schedule rather than thinking in terms of clock hours. Watch duties and responsibilities. The watch on duty was responsible for sailing the ship, maintaining course, adjusting sails as wind conditions changed, standing lookout, and performing various routine tasks. The watch was commanded by an officer or by an experienced sailor designated as watch leader, who had authority over the watch members and was responsible for the ship's safe operation during that period. The helmsman, the sailor actually steering the ship, held a position of responsibility and required skill and attention. The helmsman stood at the ship's wheel or tiller, maintaining the course ordered by the watch officer and making constant small adjustments to compensate for wind shifts and wave action. Good helmsmen could hold a course steadily with minimal wandering, while poor helmsmen allowed the ship to drift off course, requiring more sail adjustments and reducing efficiency. The lookouts were posted at elevated positions, including the masthead and the bow, watching for other ships, land, hazards, and changes in weather. The masthead lookout, positioned on a platform high on the mast, could see farther than those on deck and had the critical responsibility of spotting sails on the horizon that might indicate prizes or threats. The bow lookout watched ahead for hazards, including reefs, shoals, floating debris, and changes in water color that might indicate shallow water. The working party, the remaining watch members not assigned to specific positions like helmsman or lookout, performed whatever tasks the watch officer ordered. These tasks might include trimming sails, coiling ropes, performing minor maintenance, pumping the bilge, or simply standing ready to respond to emergencies. The working party provided the labor needed to operate the ship and to respond to changing conditions. The watch on duty had to be ready to respond immediately to any situation requiring quick action. Sudden wind shifts might require rapid sail adjustments to prevent damage or to maintain course. Squalls appearing on the horizon might necessitate reducing sail quickly before the wind struck. Sightings of other vessels might require course changes to close with potential prizes or to evade pursuers. The watch had to maintain alertness despite the tedium of routine watches when nothing eventful occurred. Off-watch time. The watch off duty was theoretically free to rest, eat, or pursue personal activities. However, the reality was more complex, as various demands intruded on off-watch time and prevented crew members from fully resting. The 4-hour watch cycle meant that a sailor finishing a watch at midnight would have 4 hours until the next watch at 4 in the morning. But this time had to cover getting below, preparing for sleep, actually sleeping, waking, and preparing to return to duty, leaving perhaps 3 hours of actual sleep time at best. The division of off-watch time was further complicated by the need to eat, maintain personal equipment, and attend to other necessities. Meals were served at specific times that might not align conveniently with watch changes, forcing crew members to choose between eating and sleeping. Personal maintenance, including washing, mending clothes, and cleaning weapons, had to be fit into off-watch periods, along with rest. The living conditions below deck made quality sleep difficult even when time was available. The crowded, noisy, and often uncomfortable conditions in the crew quarters meant that true rest was elusive. Snoring from other crew members, the sounds of men moving about, the creaking of the ship's structure, and the constant motion all interfered with sleep. The heat and poor ventilation in tropical waters made the below-deck spaces stifling, while cold weather made them damp and chill. The hammock sleeping arrangement, while better than sleeping on hard deck, had its own challenges. Hammocks required skill to enter and exit without falling. They swayed with the ship's motion, which some found soothing, but others found disorienting. They provided limited space for a sleeper, making it difficult to shift positions. The close spacing of hammocks in crowded quarters meant that a restless sleeper in one hammock could disturb neighbors. All-hands situations. Certain situations required all hands on deck regardless of the watch schedule. Heavy weather requiring sail changes, combat situations, anchoring or getting underway, and various emergencies could summon the entire crew to duty. These all-hands calls disrupted the watch system and could leave the entire crew exhausted if they occurred frequently or lasted for extended periods. Storm conditions often required all hands because the work of handling sails in heavy wind and seas exceeded what a single watch could manage safely. Reducing sail area as storms approached required many hands to furl sails that were thrashing violently in the wind. All hands might labor for hours securing the ship for the storm, then might have to remain on deck during the storm to respond to damage or changed conditions. After the storm passed, all hands might be needed again to set sails and resume normal operations. Combat or potential combat situations brought all hands on deck to prepare the ship for action and to man battle stations. Gun crews had to be at their guns, boarders had to be armed and ready, and all systems had to be prepared for the violence of ship-to-ship combat. The tension of waiting for combat to begin could last for hours as ships maneuvered for position, keeping the entire crew on edge and preventing rest. The cumulative effect of all hands calls was to further reduce the already inadequate sleep that watch systems allowed. A crew that had its sleep disrupted several times in a night by storm conditions or alarms would be exhausted the following day, but would still have to stand their regular watches. The exhaustion accumulated over days and weeks, leaving crews in a state of chronic sleep deprivation that affected judgment, coordination, and morale. Sleep deprivation effects. The chronic lack of adequate sleep affected pirate crews in multiple ways, creating physical, mental, and emotional impacts that shaped behavior and effectiveness. Understanding these effects provides context for many aspects of pirate life, including decision-making, discipline, and the attraction of opportunities to rest in port. Physical effects. Sleep deprivation had immediate physical effects, including fatigue, reduced coordination, and decreased strength. Sailors working aloft in the rigging, while exhausted, faced increased risks of falls that could cause serious injury or death. The precision required for tasks like splicing rope, maintaining equipment, or handling weapons suffered when crew members were too tired to focus properly. The immune system's effectiveness declined with inadequate sleep, making sailors more vulnerable to the various diseases that plagued ships. Scurvy, dysentery, fevers, and other ailments affected sleep-deprived sailors more severely and were harder to recover from. The combination of poor diet, harsh conditions, and inadequate rest created a downward spiral where health steadily deteriorated. Chronic exhaustion made physical labor harder and slower. Tasks that a well-rested sailor could complete quickly and efficiently took longer and required more effort when the sailor was exhausted. This reduced efficiency meant that watches had to work harder to accomplish the same results, further contributing to fatigue. The cycle of exhaustion leading to reduced efficiency, leading to more work, leading to more exhaustion, was difficult to break. Injuries became more likely as exhausted sailors made mistakes or reacted too slowly to avoid hazards. A tired sailor might misjudge a distance, lose his grip on a rope, or fail to notice a hazard until too late. The cumulative toll of these small injuries and near misses added to the general misery of shipboard life and occasionally resulted in serious harm. Mental and cognitive effects. Sleep deprivation impaired judgment and decision-making, affecting everyone from ordinary sailors to captains. Exhausted men made poor choices, failed to consider consequences, and acted impulsively in ways they might not if well rested. Captains operating on inadequate sleep might make tactical errors, misjudge situations, or fail to recognize dangers that would be obvious with a clear mind. Attention and concentration suffered dramatically with inadequate sleep. Lookouts who should have been scanning the horizon for sails or hazards instead struggled to keep their eyes open and might miss critical sightings. Helmsmen lost focus and allowed the ship to wander off course. Workers performing repetitive tasks made errors that well-rested sailors would not. Memory and learning were impaired by chronic sleep deprivation. New crew members trying to learn the numerous skills required for seamanship found the learning process harder when they were constantly exhausted. Experienced sailors might forget details of procedures they normally knew well. The knowledge transfer that should have occurred naturally as experienced sailors taught novices was hindered by the mental fog of exhaustion. Reaction times slowed with inadequate sleep, creating dangers in situations requiring quick responses. A sailor aloft who started to fall might not react quickly enough to catch himself. A helmsman who needed to turn the ship quickly to avoid a collision might respond too slowly. In combat, slow reactions could mean the difference between life and death. Emotional and psychological effects. The emotional toll of chronic exhaustion manifested in increased irritability, shorter tempers, and more frequent conflicts. Sailors who might normally tolerate minor annoyances became angry over trivial matters. The close quarters and forced cooperation of shipboard life meant that this irritability created constant tension and frequent arguments. Depression and hopelessness were common among chronically sleep-deprived sailors. The endless cycle of watches with inadequate rest between them, the discomfort of shipboard life, and the lack of any prospect for genuine rest created a grinding despair. Some sailors became withdrawn and uncommunicative, while others became reckless and took unnecessary risks. Anxiety and paranoia could develop as exhaustion affected mental stability. Sailors might become convinced that they were being persecuted, that the ship was doomed, or that disasters were imminent. The line between reasonable caution and irrational fear could blur when exhaustion clouded judgment. These psychological effects could spread through a crew, creating mass anxiety or panic in stressful situations. The motivation to continue working and following orders required effort when exhaustion made sleep the only thing that seemed to matter. Officers had to push exhausted crews to complete necessary tasks, sometimes requiring threats or punishments to overcome the overwhelming desire to simply stop working and collapse. The resentment this created added to the emotional burden everyone carried. Strategies for coping with sleep deprivation. Sailors developed various strategies for coping with chronic exhaustion, though none were fully effective at eliminating the problem. These coping mechanisms allowed crews to function despite inadequate rest, though always at reduced capacity compared to what they could achieve if well rested. Napping when possible. The most straightforward coping strategy was to sleep whenever opportunities arose, grabbing short naps during off-watch periods or during lulls in activity. Experienced sailors developed the ability to fall asleep almost instantly when they had a few minutes, taking advantage of every chance for rest, no matter how brief. The quality of these short naps was poor, as the sleep was fragmented and often occurred in uncomfortable positions or noisy environments. However, even poor quality sleep provided some restoration, and the cumulative effect of multiple short naps could partially compensate for the lack of long, uninterrupted sleep periods. Some sailors became expert at sleeping in unlikely places and positions, able to doze while sitting on deck, while wedged into corners below, or even while performing routine tasks that didn't require full attention. This skill was valuable but also dangerous, as falling asleep at the wrong time or in the wrong position could lead to accidents. The ability to wake quickly and be alert within seconds of waking was essential for sailors who might be called to duty at any moment. Deep sleep, from which waking required time to become oriented, was a luxury sailors couldn't afford. The perpetual state of semi-wakefulness that resulted was exhausting in itself, but was necessary for survival. Watch standing techniques. Sailors developed techniques for staying awake during watches when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. Physical movement helped, so sailors on watch might pace back and forth, stamp their feet, or perform simple exercises to keep blood flowing and maintain alertness. The cold and discomfort of night watches in bad weather had the perverse advantage of making sleep impossible. though the misery was its own burden. Conversation with watchmates helped pass time and maintain alertness. Sailors would talk about past experiences, tell stories, discuss plans for when they reached port, or simply comment on the weather and sea conditions. The social interaction provided stimulation that helped fight drowsiness, though watch officers sometimes had to balance allowing conversation against maintaining proper vigilance. Chewing tobacco, when available, provided a mild stimulant effect that helped some sailors stay alert. The ritual of preparing and using tobacco also provided activity that occupied attention and hands. However, tobacco was not always available, and its effectiveness was limited. Physical discomfort could be used as a tool to prevent sleep. Sailors might deliberately stand in uncomfortable positions, expose themselves to spray and wind, or otherwise create conditions that made dozing impossible. While this added to overall misery, it prevented the potentially fatal consequences of falling asleep on watch. Sleep debt and recovery. The sleep debt accumulated over weeks or months at sea could not be fully repaid during the brief periods when rest was possible. However, when ships reached port and anchored, crews could finally get extended rest that partially addressed the accumulated exhaustion. The first few days in port were often spent sleeping for long hours, with sailors collapsing into hammocks and sleeping 12 or 16 hours at a stretch. This recovery sleep had remarkable restorative effects. Sailors who had been irritable, depressed, and ineffective while exhausted became more cheerful, energetic, and competent after several good nights of sleep. The transformation could be dramatic, demonstrating how much the chronic exhaustion had affected behavior and capabilities. However, the recovery was never complete before the ship returned to sea and the cycle of sleep deprivation began again. The brief respite in port allowed partial recovery, but could not fully eliminate the accumulated debt from months of inadequate rest. Many sailors lived in a perpetual state of partial exhaustion, catching up slightly during port visits, but never fully recovering before returning to sea. The health consequences of this chronic sleep deprivation were serious but poorly understood at the time. The connection between adequate sleep and long-term health was not recognized in the 18th century, so the damage being done by years of inadequate rest was not appreciated. Sailors accepted exhaustion as an inevitable part of their lives, rather than recognizing it as a health problem with serious consequences. Special watch situations. Certain circumstances created variations in the normal watch routine, either intensifying the demands on crews or providing occasional relief. Understanding these special situations reveals the flexibility of watch systems and the additional burdens they could create. Storm watches. Heavy weather required modified watch arrangements because the dangers and work demands exceeded normal operations. During major storms, the entire crew might remain on deck or in a state of readiness for extended periods, with no formal watch rotation. Sailors would work until exhausted, rest briefly in whatever shelter they could find, then return to work when called or when they regained enough energy to continue. The work during storms crews included securing loose items, adjusting or reducing sail area, manning pumps to control water entering the ship, and responding to damage as it occurred. The violence of storms meant that rigging might part, sails might tear, and equipment might break loose, requiring immediate repairs to prevent further damage or loss of control. The duration of storms varied from a few hours for summer squalls to days for major hurricanes or winter gales. Extended storms left crews utterly exhausted, having worked for 24 hours or more with minimal rest. The physical and mental toll could be severe, with some sailors collapsing from exhaustion once the storm passed and the immediate danger was over. Recovery from storm watches took time, as the accumulated exhaustion and stress could not be overcome immediately. Ships might reduce activity after major storms to allow crews to rest, though this meant making less progress toward destinations and accepting reduced vigilance against threats. The balance between allowing recovery and maintaining operational capability was difficult to manage. Combat watches. Preparing for combat and fighting battles disrupted normal watch systems completely. All hands would be called to battle stations hours before combat began, with crew members assigned to specific positions and duties. The waiting before combat was tense and exhausting, with sailors knowing they might soon be fighting for their lives, but unable to do anything except wait and prepare. The battle itself might last from a few minutes to several hours, depending on the circumstances. During combat, sailors performed their assigned duties with whatever focus and energy they could muster, despite exhaustion and fear. The chaos and violence of battle produced intense physical and emotional stress that was draining even for well-rested sailors, and was overwhelming for those already exhausted from inadequate sleep. After combat, whether successful or not, crews had to secure the ship, tend to wounded, make repairs, and process prisoners or plunder if the battle had been won. This work could take many hours, meaning that the total disruption from a combat encounter could span 12 or 24 hours or more. The exhaustion following combat was profound, combining physical fatigue with emotional and psychological stress. The recovery from combat was complicated by the processing of prizes, the integration of forced men from captured ships, and the division of plunder. These activities created work and excitement that further delayed rest. Celebrations following successful captures could extend through nights, with crews drinking and carousing rather than sleeping, despite their exhaustion. Anchor watches. When ships were anchored rather than underway, the watch requirements changed but did not disappear. Anchor watches were smaller than sailing watches, as the work of sailing the ship was not required, but vigilance still had to be maintained. The anchor watch checked that the anchor was holding, watched for other vessels, monitored weather conditions, and maintained security against theft or attack. The reduced demands of anchor watches meant that more crew members could be off-duty simultaneously, allowing better rest than was possible while underway. In safe anchorages where attack was unlikely, Anchor watches might be quite relaxed, with minimal work required and crew members able to sleep more. This respite was welcome after extended periods at sea. However, not all anchorages were safe, and some situations required maintaining high vigilance even at anchor. When anchored in hostile or uncertain locations, the watch had to remain alert for attacks from shore or from other vessels. When weather threatened, the watch had to be ready to respond quickly to prevent the ship dragging anchor and going aground. The rotation of anchor watches might allow individual sailors to sleep for longer uninterrupted periods than was possible while underway. Instead of 4 hours on and 4 hours off, anchor watches might be organized to allow 8 or 12 hours off duty for crew members not on watch. This longer rest period was valuable, but still did not fully compensate for the accumulated sleep debt from time at sea. The night watch experience. The night watches, particularly the middle watch from midnight to 4 in the morning, were among the most challenging duty periods. The darkness, the cold in some climates, the loneliness, and the human body's natural tendency towards sleep during nighttime hours combined to make night watches dreaded by many sailors. Darkness and isolation. The darkness of night at sea was profound, with only starlight and perhaps moonlight providing any illumination. On overcast nights or during the new moon phase, the darkness was nearly absolute, making it difficult to see the deck or rigging even a few feet away. This darkness made routine tasks harder and created hazards as sailors moved about the ship performing their duties. The isolation felt by night watch standards was significant. While the rest of the crew slept below, the watch on deck felt alone and separated from their shipmates. The vast darkness of the sea surrounding the ship emphasized the tiny human presence in an enormous, indifferent ocean. This isolation could be psychologically wearing, particularly for imaginative sailors who populated the darkness with fears and anxieties. The night watch standers had to maintain vigilance against threats that might approach unseen in the darkness. Other ships could be upon them before being spotted in the dark. Reefs or land could appear suddenly with no advance warning. The watch had to stay alert, despite the darkness making their task harder, and despite their exhaustion encouraging sleep. The sound environment at night differed from daytime, with the absence of daytime activity making the ship's sounds more prominent. The creaking of rigging, the splash of waves against the hull, and the whistle of wind through ropes created an auditory landscape that some found soothing and others found eerie. Unexplained sounds could create alarm as the watch tried to determine their source in the darkness. Physical discomfort. Night watches often brought physical discomfort from cold, damp, or wind. Even in tropical waters, nights could be cool enough to be uncomfortable for sailors in thin clothing wet with spray or rain. In higher latitudes or during winter months, night watches could be miserably cold, with sailors shivering through their 4-hour duty periods with inadequate clothing or shelter. The dew that formed on deck and rigging during clear nights created slippery surfaces that increased the danger of falls. Sailors moving about the dark, dew-slicked deck had to move carefully to avoid losing their footing. The dampness seeped into clothing and made sailors feel colder and more miserable as watches progressed. Wind at night could be stronger and more variable than during the day, requiring watchstanders to be attentive to sail trim and ship handling. The wind created wind chill that made the actual temperature feel much colder, and that dried out exposed skin and made eyes water. Sailors learned to position themselves to minimize wind exposure when possible while still performing their duties. The discomfort served one useful purpose. It made falling asleep difficult. A sailor who was cold, wet, and uncomfortable was less likely to doze off despite exhaustion than one who was warm and comfortable. The misery of night watches thus provided its own safeguard against the most dangerous consequence of exhaustion: falling asleep on watch. Hallucinations and perceptual distortions. Extreme exhaustion combined with darkness and isolation could produce hallucinations and perceptual distortions that affected night watch standers. Sailors might see shapes or movement in the darkness that were not there, misinterpreting shadows or reflections as sails, land, or other phenomena. The exhausted mind attempted to make sense of ambiguous visual stimuli and sometimes produced false interpretations. Auditory hallucinations could occur, with sailors hearing voices, music, or other sounds that had no physical source. These hallucinations could be quite convincing, leading sailors to investigate phantom sounds or to believe they heard calls for help or warnings of danger. The realization that the sounds were hallucinations rather than reality could be disturbing. The line between being awake and briefly dozing could blur, with micro-sleeps producing dream fragments that seemed real for a moment before the sailor snapped back to full wakefulness. These episodes were disorienting and could produce confused memories of events that never occurred. Sailors might believe they had seen or done things during their watch that they had only dreamed. The accumulated stress of these perceptual distortions could make sailors doubt their own senses and judgment. A sailor who had experienced hallucinations might question whether a real sighting was genuine or whether it was another hallucination. This self-doubt could be dangerous if it led to ignoring real threats or failing to report legitimate sightings. Long-term consequences. The chronic sleep deprivation experienced by pirates over months and years of sea service had long-term consequences that affected health, behavior, and longevity. While the immediate effects of exhaustion were obvious, the cumulative damage from years of inadequate rest was equally significant, though less visible. Health impacts. Chronic sleep deprivation compromised immune system function, making sailors more vulnerable to infectious diseases and less able to fight off infections when they occurred. The various fevers, fluxes, and other diseases that swept through ship crews affected sleep-deprived sailors more severely and with higher mortality rates than would have occurred in well-rested populations. Cardiovascular health suffered from chronic exhaustion, with increased stress on the heart and circulatory system. while the specific mechanisms were not understood in the 18th century, modern research has confirmed that inadequate sleep increases risks of heart disease, stroke, and other cardiovascular problems. Pirates who survived years at sea often died relatively young of causes that may have been linked to their years of sleep deprivation. Mental health deteriorated with extended periods of inadequate rest. Depression, anxiety, and other psychological problems became more common and more severe in chronically exhausted populations. Some sailors developed drinking problems as they used alcohol to cope with the stress and exhaustion, creating additional health problems and contributing to the social dysfunction common among maritime populations. Cognitive decline could occur with prolonged sleep deprivation, affecting memory, learning ability, and judgment. Sailors who spent years at sea with inadequate rest might find their mental capacities diminished compared to peers who had received adequate sleep. This decline was often attributed to other causes, including alcohol, disease, or simply aging, but sleep deprivation likely contributed significantly. Behavioral changes. Chronic exhaustion produced lasting changes in behavior and personality. Sailors who had spent years operating on inadequate sleep might become habitually irritable, aggressive, or withdrawn. The emotional regulation that well-rested people take for granted became difficult for those who had never experienced sustained adequate rest. The risk-taking behavior common among sailors might have been partially driven by exhaustion-impaired judgment. Decisions that well-rested people would recognize as dangerous might seem reasonable to exhausted sailors whose capacity to assess risk was compromised. This could contribute to the reckless behavior that characterized some pirates and that led to their eventual capture or death. The social dysfunction common in maritime communities might have been exacerbated by chronic exhaustion. The difficulty maintaining relationships, the tendency toward violence, and the preference for immediate gratification over long-term planning that characterized many sailors could all have been influenced by years of inadequate sleep affecting judgment and emotional control. Life expectancy. The cumulative health impacts of chronic sleep deprivation likely contributed to the relatively short life expectancy of sailors in general and pirates in particular. While violent death, disease, and accidents were more obvious causes of early mortality, the underlying health damage from years of inadequate rest may have made sailors more vulnerable to all of these threats. Pirates who managed to retire from active piracy and live on shore often found that years of harsh conditions, including sleep deprivation, had left them with damaged health that limited their remaining years. Even those who had accumulated enough wealth to live comfortably might not enjoy their retirement for long if their health was too compromised to allow them to benefit from their changed circumstances. The tragic irony was that the promise of wealth that attracted men to piracy often came at the cost of health damage that prevented them from enjoying whatever wealth they did acquire. A pirate who survived to retire with a comfortable fortune might have so damaged his health through years of inadequate sleep, poor diet, and harsh conditions that he died within a few years of leaving the sea, having traded decades of life for a brief period of wealth.